there are people from other kingdoms who may or may not know me. I am Duke Laurelen from the Middle Kingdom, and I was invited very happily to give this class. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to do that for a number of reasons. One of which is because we're not able to be in person and we're not able to do the things we're normally used to doing in the SCA, it becomes really important to use the available platforms, the technology, everything that lets us stay in communication with each other. And it's terrifically important to understand that despite the fact that we're all separated by screens, this is very much like sitting in a great hall with all of you for me, because I clearly understand and behave as if we are all sitting there together with our cups and enjoying the company we all share. I'd like to thank everybody, Oswin and everybody else from RUM, Royal University of the Mid-Realm, for arranging this. And it's really a delight to be able to talk to everybody with something that's really important to me. My goals here are really partially instructive, but more to offer some of the things that I've discovered over the years. For me, over the years corresponds to nearly half a century in the SCA and 42 years as a member of the Order of Chivalry. My goal when I first found the SCA was simple. I had a very clear vision of what a medieval knight looked like, and I wanted to look just like that. And for all of us who ever, when we were children, which we still are as adults if we think like children rather than being childish, we have our clear visions of what our current Middle Ages look like. We have our clear visions of what we look like. And for those of us who first start fighting in the SCA, putting together the rudimentary armor that just meets the standards and lets us get out there and have a lot of fun, little by little, we spend time studying, not just learning to fight, but learning about armor, learning about our garments, learning to be social parts of the current Middle Ages, living within our kingdoms, and being part of the greater populace of the known world. There's around 35,000 of us who are official members, and quite a few more who are active participants who are not members. So it's important to remember that for all of them that are fighters, a great deal of people struggle to begin with, especially when they are in places that don't necessarily have more experienced fighters. So what I'm hoping to present, and then offer some resources at the end, is a bunch of useful information rather than just pictures and take a look at that kind of things. Hopefully this will be concrete. A little bit of operational stuff. I'd like to save all questions for the end. I will answer every single question that comes in. We'll be taking a list. So either share your question on the Facebook feed or in the chat feed of the Zoom call, if you're part of the Zoom call. And we will make sure of that. It's super important to me to address everything that any of you'd like to know if I'm able to, and I don't want to leave anybody out. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. So one of the most important elements for modern medieval combat recreation is one of those that's paid the least attention to. It's about the garments that are worn under our armor. These are absolutely the most essential part of our beginning recreation. It's not just about the beautiful civilian garb that any of us wear when we're at SCA events or other recreation events in any other organization we might be part of. It is actually critical if one is exploring more authentic armor to have the correct mounting, the wearing of it, and ultimately being able to fight in it, because truthfully, we don't want to spend time fighting our armor when we should be spending time fighting with our opponents. And that's symptomatic of what so many of us struggle with in the SCA, especially when we first begin. Things that don't fit correctly, Well, most of us start with armor that doesn't fit correctly. But as time goes by, we start suffering from, that's good enough. I'll just throw some tape on it and that'll be good. And we spend a lot of time struggling with these things. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is how we get from SCA armor, or even armor that's used in some of the steel fighting communities, whether it's HMB, BOTN, ACL, INCF, or any of the other organizations out there here in the United States and even other places in the world that do recreation medieval combat. What we do actually is inherently dangerous. What we do in the SCA is actually a more accurate reproduction of many of the tournaments of peace that they would have had in the 14th and 15th century. And it's important to remember that. The guys back then would not have compromised on their harness. It was built to do certain things. And when they were wearing their harness of war, even if it wasn't a tournament, it was mounted and worn correctly and tailored for them. One of the important things I'd like to make sure we mention at the outset, what we are talking about is arming garments that are meant for the class of fighting men of that era who could afford the best armor, the best plate of the time, and the best arming garments to support that. The villeins, the sergeants, even the lower ranked esquires might not necessarily have had as good a kit, of course, as the knightly class itself. The knightly class, and especially the higher ranking individuals with ties to royal families or rank, title, and lands, they would have had everything that was necessary, because the garments, even if they were beautifully made in silk and brocade to be worn under armor, those garments were made to do a very specific job. Just like the armor that they supported, those garments were made to keep a person from losing his life. It is important to remember that our arming garments are our armor as well. So there are many people who have the finest armorers in the world nowadays, because we can certainly get great armor. There's beautiful custom-made harness, it's expensive, but all too often we find people wearing modern garments, even jeans. You know, you jury rig mounting, you use something with some belts or even string, heaven knows, duct tape, for attachment of armor parts. Again, this leads to you continuously fighting with your armor, and you don't really want to do that. You know, it's funny, we can spend a lot of time putting together things that look utterly beautiful on the outside, really gorgeous steel harness, or harness made in leather and steel or other materials of the period and you know, part of the world that you're interested in. But quite often, what is worn under that is a compromise. Sometimes just because, that's easier, you know, oh, that'll do, that'll work. So the purpose of what I'd like to talk about tonight is really a compendium of period illustrations, some explanations, practical demonstration of some period arming garments, wearing of the harness of the 14th and early 15th century. I'll be using myself as a live action model. At times, I'm actually wearing parts of my own harness, which you will see a little more detailed in both pictures. A little later, I'll be sharing my screen with some slides, and we'll just move on through it. And then at the end, we'll get to the questions. So the development of arming garments was not a stagnant thing. It developed along with armor itself. But a fascinating thing is that arming garments have to be tailored to fit the person wearing them. And what we see is that virtually from the 9th, really through the beginning of the 14th century, arming garments don't change much. And that's because mail was the primary armor of that period. Some sort of padding was worn underneath, later called Gammazons, padded jacks, some material were worn under mail. It became more sophisticated, of course, as time went by. between what was worn in the 10th, 11th, 12th century. But as you started getting into the late 11th through the era of the early tournaments in particular, and the Crusades of the late 12th century and into the 13th, armor started to grow some sophisticated additions, and therefore so did the arming garments. As we got into the 14th century, we get into the first quarter of the 14th century, and this has been euphemistically called the transition period in various works. And that's where things start changing really, really fast. The difference between what is worn in 1320, which is almost synonymous of what was worn with 50 years earlier, and what was worn by the time of the Battle of Crécy, at least by English knights, and even later, the Battle of Poitiers just 10 years later, 1346 to 1356, huge changes occur. Small pieces of plate and leather together start being replaced by large plate. Shapeless coats of plate that really look much like cylindrical barrels start giving way to carefully shaped coats of plate, and later brigandines, and later large plate harness, of course. The most significant key to understanding what we're talking about lies in understanding that the garments are armor and they're not separate from the steel and leather of the harness itself. So what we want to talk about first is civilian garments, because the arming garments worn by the fighting men of the time were not really very different than the civilian garments that they wore in this period of time. So I'll be offering some pictures, descriptions, some visual aids. We'll put it all together as I get into the discussion, and I won't just be sitting here talking at you. But the elements of not only what are the garments, but how things are attached. There are some simple answers, and they're often tremendously misunderstood. One of the worst difficulties of modern reenactors are how you put on your harness. And this will bring us to arming points. What arming points really are, how they work, why they did what they did then, and why we should emulate them too. One of the things you'll hear me say more than once this evening is they were much smarter than us. They had 1,000 years of development behind them, leading right up to the best armor of the age and the arming garments to support it. Their lives depended on it. In keeping with that, they did not take shortcuts. They did the things that were not only necessary and sufficient, but that were elegant and correct. And there were reasons for everything. So arming points, which we'll talk about in a bit, they are the method by which you attach armor to the body and to the arming garments themselves. Also, I'd like to add that I have posted in the Company of the Golden Star Facebook page, which any of you are free to find and join, which is my 14th century company in the SCA, links, PDF documents, which you will find this entire talk in a document, and also a treatise on arming points, what they are, how to tie them, how they work, and all of these other things. So what I will do is scroll for myself on my little outline here and figure out where I want to go. Okay, so one of the things I'm going to need to do is share my screen. Am I open for that now? Great, thanks. Let's see here. I very much hope everybody can see the first slide, and it's a resource slide for mid 14th through early 15th century arming garments. What we've got is a lot of pictures here, and that's how I'm going to be working this. So I'm going to talk about the civilian garments first, because they're really important. Now, on the frontispiece here are some really wonderful pictures of knights of the 14th century, but there's some really terrifically important things here. This is all elegant garments that I'm circling with my cursor here. You know, guys standing around in beautiful Gammazons and plate armor. We can see armor being put on a noble duke. I think this is Berry, I can't remember. But let's talk about civilians. These are fighting men of the 14th century. They're just hanging out. These illustrations come from a number of the sources of the 14th and early 15th century. And you can see the elements of what was high fashion of the time. Fighting men of that time were very fit. They had to be. That was their life, it was their job. Also, they were generally very rich. Again, we are talking about the upper classes, the nobility, the knightly class. So these guys, they are all wearing beautiful coat-hardies. These fashions persisted throughout the 14th century into the 15th century until they got shorter and shorter and became doublets of the later period, well past the Wars of the Roses. But for what we're going to be talking about here, we are seeing the height of fashion of basically the entire second half of the 14th century. What you can see is they enhance and reveal and show off the silhouette of the knightly body. These things are made in very particular ways. Those people who make clothing of the 14th century will certainly recognize grand assiette sleeves, which prevent a garment from riding up when one raises one's arm. That also applies to ensuring that one's arming garments stay where they're supposed to when your armor are tied to it. The gentleman that we see standing here and hanging out, as opposed to this individual here, who may be an esquire, maybe a servant, but he is not wearing the highest fashion, though he is wearing things that emulate that. He's also wearing a tabard, and he has what looks like a towel over his shoulder, so he may well be a servant. Another picture of guys just hanging out. Well, it's obvious who are the ranking gentlemen here by what they are wearing. Of course, there's a ducal coronet. Ermine, all beautifully tailored coat-hardy garments of the time. Many of them are buttons, some of them are spiral laced. And there's a fascinating thing here. There are two older gentlemen sitting with them. They're the ones in the purple, between the younger men who have fine, fit figures. These two are or were fighting men. They may be somebody's father in this picture. You can see their garments are not that tailored. They might be somewhat older, and in fact, they look it. And they might be somewhat more portly after having ended their life in harness. But all of them are dressed very elegantly as civilians of the time period. And it's really important to understand that the arming garments we're talking about grew out of this. Okay, so as we get into discussing arming garments, one of the things that gets brought up continuously is the very, very famous coat-hardy, or sometimes called Gammazon of Charles Brewer. This is around 1360, right in the period we're talking about. It's a wonderful example. And I want everybody to understand as you go forward and end up in discussions with people about these things, this is a civilian garment. It is not an arming garment. This was not worn as part of armor, and it was the height of an elegant fashion. So it's a fascinating thing because it's not an arming coat or a Gammazon. The interior points that you can see in the red circles are fascinating because this is virtually the only example we know of a garment that still has all of its interior points. But these points were used for attaching the hose in a very genteel way to allow the well-dressed man to move normally. The thing about this, oh wait, I'll give one further comment here. The thing about this beautiful, beautiful coat hardie is that this is a template for the arming Gammazons, the arming coats of the time, and they emulate the civilian garments. A word about hose. In the 14th century, throughout the entire century and into the 15th, we see split hose being worn. In many cases, the split hose was tied to either the belt of brays, which were your small clothes, your underwear, or sometimes to the interior of a tightly fitting garment, a well-tailored garment like the Charles Brewer pourpoint. The thing about split hose, non-joined hose, is that it wasn't just tied in the front. If you notice the points in the circles, you'll see there are points on the front sides, the back, and even the middle, but slightly offset on the center seam. That's because for a gentleman, he never exposed his brays. That was underwear. Those were under his hose. So if he were to bend over or stand with his foot on a box in some noble way, hanging out like we see the other guys here, where you're just sitting around, you are not exposing the interior of your small clothes. This is also very important. Now, as we get into the 15th century and into the era of the Wars of the Roses, we find that eventually joined hose, and even into the 16th century, 100 years later, joined hose becomes the thing. But while there was split hose, nowadays it's sometimes kind of difficult to emulate this. So there are a number of good commercial or homemade alternatives, which are joined hose. They're basically like wearing tights, and I would never, ever demean anybody or eschew anybody from trying to do that. I wear joined hose. I buy mine from Revival because they make a very nice product, because they do apply to the phrase, it's not only mostly authentic, just a little late for what I'm talking about here, but it is easier as well. Hose, like all the undergarments, were made of all natural fiber, just like all of the other arming garments are. That is to say, linen, wool, silk, cotton. There are a lot of variations. In many cases, the construction of arming garments, like civilian garments, was very, very heavily proscribed by law in what they were going to be made with. So let's talk about what are the arming garments? How does a person get dressed? Well, they get dressed in arming garments the same way they got dressed in their civilian clothes. You start with your small clothes. Let me unshare my screen. Can I do this? So what are the arming garments of the 14th century? Everything goes on in layers. You start with your small clothes, as I said, brays, then hose, then shoes, shirt, sometimes pour point for hose. Other times the hose might be pointed to the brays themselves. And now we come to the very first element of arming garment. It's called a Lindeneer. A few comments along with how hose is worn. Authenticity nowadays comes at a price, and that price is tailoring. So if you want to explore things like really beautifully made hose, beautifully made brays, undergarments, and the overgarments, do by all means, but make sure that either yourself or the person that you work with making the garments for you fits you correctly. Things should be tightly fitted, clearly. I can only repeat what my own armorer told me: thou shalt not gain, nor shalt thou lose any weight, nor shalt thou change in stature nor size. So you do your best to stay in fighting trim once you have whatever is made for you. So the Lindeneer, this is the primary and specific attachment for leg harness to mount with points. There are a lot of mounting schemes nowadays that you see in the SCA and either other recreation groups. Prevalent modern mounting schemes of all kinds. There's suspensions from shoulders, seat belts, suspenders, vests, weight belts, modern military deuce, all sorts of similar things. These are not only incorrect, but they just don't work as well. Again, they were smarter than us. They had the garments that did the jobs they were supposed to do. And anything else, if it had worked better, it would have worked better. So a modern exception to this, however, is what's commonly called a pour point nowadays. It's used by many reenactors for mounting leg harness. And it looks a lot like a vest, but the key is that a well-tailored pour point is tight-fitting and laced at the hips. That is also the important key to a Lindeneer. It is tight-fitting, laced to fit closely and tightly at the hips, because leg armor is attached and suspends from the hips, not from the shoulders, not from the upper body, from the hips. And this is true in modern military ruck as well. Any of you who have had service experience know that your ruck sits on a hip belt. The high center of gravity of that is meant to ride low. Same thing for our brethren in arms of 500 years ago. So I'm not going to present the history of the Lindeneer, but it does go back, documented in one way or the other, well into the 12th century, when male chausses and gamboised cuishes, a padded leg armor, was worn under the mail, and those were pointed to a thing that was very much like a Lindeneer. A Lindeneer nowadays is sometimes mistaken for a thing called a seat belt, but it is not the same thing at all. And it's important to understand that. So what is a Lindeneer? A Lindeneer is made of gamboised fabric, and it is padded and sewn with eyelets for points to pass through. It is a wide, tailored, belt-like garment that fits, as I said, tightly around the hips, and laces to take the weight of the leg harness. Laces so that it can be drawn as tight as possible. Belts and buckles are bulky. They didn't use them. And they are hard pressed to bring something as tight as lacing can. So I'm going to share my screen again, and hope I won't. Yay. There. So here's a Lindeneer, a good example of one. As you can see, This is a really good example of what I just described. A further note, and you can see it written on the slide, where for all of the images, especially of live people nowadays, I've done my best to make sure I've credited these things, whether or not they were copyrighted. They were available on the net, but nonetheless, I think it's really important to credit these things. So, important note for those of you who are into 14th century stuff: Ian Lespina on YouTube as Knight Errant has a super large compendium of research and studies going back many years. He's an amazingly excellent resource for some of the most beautiful 14th century armor, arming garments, clothing, research, resource, and other information. And he's done a fantastic little paper on the Lindeneer, which you can get through his little YouTube links. I have a copy myself, and I could probably dig it out and send it to you. So what I'm illustrating here is Ian Lespina's example of some of his latest research into a 14th century Lindeneer. One of the fascinating things about Lindeneers is that in 14th century and into the early 15th century in London, the Guild of Lindeneer Makers had many lawsuits pending against the Guild of Belters and Pursemakers, because the belters were making what they called belts, but they had points hanging from them to hang leg armor. And they weren't supposed to be making big leather Lindeneers because the Guild of Lindeneer Makers made those. So it's fascinating, like litigious society everywhere in the world in the 14th century, the English Lindeneer makers took the belt and purse makers to task to ensure that they all had their equal divisions of labor. One of the fascinating things is it's actually much, much better to have a Lindeneer that, that supports your leg harness rather than a thick leather. And that's why also C belts, weight belts, modern things like that, they don't conform to the body the right way. They tend to ride on the points of the shoulders or dig into the short ribs, that kind of thing. So what we're seeing here is an example of something that mounts to the hips. Further, here are some other examples. These are all modern. I've taken all of these just from open sources on the web. Some are manufactured by various companies, and it's obvious that they all do the same sorts of jobs, except this one at the bottom. And where you see belts, it becomes very easy to see that buckles and belts over this do not let this ride smoothly against the body. It is certainly doable, especially if the buckles are put in the back and somebody puts them on. One of the other things you see is the shapes that let the leg harness attach. And I'll get to discussing this in just a second, because how these things attach become extremely important. Leg harness, arm harness, and all other harness does not hang from the body. Armor is tied to the body. Now, I've taken this picture from the Arm Street catalog. The reason I did so is because it's actually a really good illustration of something that's correct. If you look closely, the leather of the leg harness, the leathers of your harness, it's tied directly to the Lindeneer. They're using modern bows rather than 14th century arming knots, and I'll talk about those a little later too. But correct knots should always be used if you can, but this is an important, critical thing. Armor does not hang from the body. It is tied to the body. This is really, really important. Here are some further examples. And again, I'm crediting them where I can. Also, I'll note here, I have no idea who this young lady is. I could not find any identification for her. However, I have used her as an example because there are some good, correct things about what she was doing. So this is from the Revival clothing website. These are examples of modern pour points. These are actually civilian garment recreations. We see these very things in many, many, many illustrations of civilian garments. But we never, and I hate the word never and always in discussing our medieval recreation activities, but we do not have any sources that I've found illustrated that shows a pourpoint used to hang armor. And it's important to remember this. The earlier Lindeneers, these are the things that hang leg armor. They are worn in such a way that, for instance, on this young lady, if this were cut right here, it would be a Lindeneer. Well, okay. This thing was prevalent for pointing hose and pointing, dependent other garments in civilian, but it was not to mount armor. However, this is precisely the sort of thing that I myself wear, because when it is tied correctly, as you see here on the right, the young lady, we are seeing a very good recreation of how things should be done. So what's the issue here? The one on the left in the red shows several errors. First, it's totally loose, and anything attached to it is actually hanging from the gentleman's shoulders. Of course, you don't want your armor hanging from your shoulders because you're going to be putting on plate, which will be on your shoulders. Also, we see, I think I can actually, yeah, I can. We see hanging strings here. That is also generally incorrect. That means that the leg harness actually can roll around back and forth, even though it's attached in two places, which is also a very well understood and often done thing. You don't just want one set of hanging strings tying your leg armor on, because your leg armor can rotate. The one on the right shows that it is very tight on her body, and as long as breathing isn't constricted, lacing it all the way up as she has done is just fine. The fact is, she could easily leave this unlaced all the way down to here, because her leg armor is supported on her hips. The leathers of her armor are pointed directly to these strange exterior loop things that she's got on her pourpoint, but that's okay. It's a modern concession, and it's very, very similar to a fixed set of points to keep her leg armor in one good place. It's a modern affectation. It works, and for the sake of approaching really good authenticity, I certainly wouldn't demean what this individual has done. Having correctly made arming garments to match your armor just means making sure the eyelets in the garment are in the location to match the eyelets in the armor. The very same thing goes for arm armor and everything else. So what I'm going to do now is once again attempt, okay, jeez. Technology challenges. Okay, one of the things I'd like to do right now is actually do a little bit of live demonstration. So, century arming garments. I'll step back. You can see I am wearing leg armor of the period. And these are pointed. So my Gammazon is also of the period, well worn and everything. And I'm also wearing arm harness. But what I'm going to do is show you how and what it is that I'm wearing underneath. Also, you'll notice that that when the garments are correctly made, they give you, by nature, the profile of the 14th century knight, because everything is supposed to fit in a very tailored way so that everything is put together. So, what we can see is my pour point. It is essentially the pour point that you saw the young lady wearing. You'll notice that I don't have it laced up any further than this, so it's basically behaving like a Lindeneer. We have the leathers of my leg harness and 2 sets of points. The 2 sets of points keep this leg harness locked in place very well and prevent it from rotating around my leg as we go, and keep it from riding down and keep it in place. You'll notice that it is tied to the pour point. It is not hanging from the pour point. This is a different set. This set of points actually supports my padded chausses. On the other side, you'll notice that I'm wearing a very, very lightly padded set of chausses. I wonder if I can do this. Underneath, you see the padded garment, which is chausses. And this brings me to an important discussion here. Padded chausses were worn, as I mentioned earlier, through the 12th and 13th century and even into the 14th century. There are some extant manuscript illustrations where we can see the knights from behind, and we can see that they were wearing what were painted as, cross-hatched gamboise or quilted garments. And those are the chausses that are sometimes worn as light padding. These are a layer of cotton with a layer of cotton batting, and a layer of cotton on the interior. They are not at all very thick. As you can see, they ride against my leg very, very tightly. And when I go to reveal how these things are made, I can tell you that though they are very, very lightly padded, normally the points are a little easier to get off. There we are. Though they're lightly padded, this is all I ever wear under my garments. One of the interesting things is the well-known Hastings manuscript from the early 15th century. And it talks about how a man shall be armed. Chausses are well tailored, and there's a reason for this. The tailoring of your arming garment and the gamboise choices that I'm wearing are fitted and pointed under the garments. And this is because in the Hastings manuscript, it talks about the hose that the fighting man is wearing, and also how he is wearing a blanket wrapped around his knees, basically, is the modern English way to put it. And the important thing about that is that it really describes wool that is to protect the knees. I'm going to once again share my screen, and There we go. Hopefully I'll be able to find things the way I need to find them from here on. So thank you for the indulgence. From what the young lady here is wearing to what I was wearing, these are what the padded chausses look like. I made a pattern for these, and Duchess Ithrillial very kindly quilted them for me, and then I cut them out because it was going to be my mistake if I made them the incorrect size. Once again, from the pourpoint, you can see the chausses and my hose. You can see how closely the chausses actually fit under my shirt and padded or pointed under the pourpoint. And the leg harness is pointed over the pourpoint. It ties to the pourpoint over the Lindeneer. This is really, really important. The points are then tied and then tucked into the armor. So this is one of the most important elements of what we are really looking at. And we see the very same thing on arms. Stop the share here for a moment because I now know how to do it and show you what we're showing live. The leathers of my arm harness point directly to the Gammazon. They do not hang from it, and this arm harness cannot move. My elbow remains where it is supposed to. Frequently we see an elbow strap in harness. So attaching your arming points to your arming garment and to the undergarments that you're using is super important. And the chausses over the hose, the Lindeneer over the chausses, the leg harness over the Lindeneer, the Gammazon over those, the arm harness over the Gammazon, then gives you the entire layering of how the harness is mounted to the body. The way these things are done, and of course over this my body harness would then be mounted. And then whether it was a full plate breast and back or a brigandine of sorts or mail, and then other harness components, the shoulder harness might be attached through points and eyelets on the shoulders. It might be attached directly to the body armor, but the points also become the way these things are supported. Now, the way these knots are tied, we frequently see them, and in the illustrations I showed a little earlier, you'll notice that it's not a normal bow. The double bow didn't really come into existence until the middle of the 16th century. These knots you see extant on everything from manuscripts to carvings to paintings to statues, sculpture of all sorts, and even still exist in some of the extant few garments and helm paddings for tournaments. We still see these knots tied. It's a very simple knot to tie, and again, you were free to go and find the document that I published on them. The knot and the arming point made correctly become the most important final piece of how to mount your armor. As I said, there are reasons they did what they did. Their lives depended on it. Well-sewn eyelets in your arming garments are important. One last thing on arming points. The arming points, you will notice in mine, are not permanently attached at all. I have a small leather pad. It's vegetable tanned leather, so it's impervious to sweat, water, or anything else. Grommets are set into it, and the points are put through it. The points then go through the eyelets in your garment. The reason for this is that when you tie it, the holes do not scrunch together. They stay exactly where they're supposed to, and they match the eyelet locations on the arming garment and on the armor leather. This is also terrifically important. So we've gone through how you build up your harness, how your arming garments work, and the completion of the arming process, of course, gets to the point where the guy wearing the stuff has to be comfortable in it. It wants to fit closely, and it should. So to finish, I hope this helps for those of you who want to explore more authentic armor, learn more about the arming garments, find out how much cooler it is and how much better and how easy it is to fight in correctly made garments the way they did in correctly fitted armor as well. Some of the modern alternatives that I showed that still follow some of the same methods of practicality, like modern joined hose, like using a pour point that's fit correctly and tied correctly to the armor, that's, you know, easily in the realm of authenticity and exploration. Our forebears, one has to remember, those fighting men of the medieval world who put their faith and their bodies and their hearts into well-made arming garments and well-made armor to mount to it. They were smart. Their methods were practical and logical. They had to be. Their lives depended on it. So do ours, because we are engaged in an albeit controlled methodology for what we do with each other, and we love it, and we take care of each other in the most unique element of honor and courtesy and chivalry on the field. Because after all, in the SCA, it is we who willingly admit to being defeated when our opponent has struck us. But we do have to depend that we will not make our opponents responsible for hurting us. I hope this has been informative. And Fernanda, I can turn it over and we can address questions.
So far, I have only seen two, and they just appeared.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see Antonio's and Ross's.
You got them.
Oh, and there's Sarah. Okay. Well, let me take them as they go. Antonio, if I may ask a really macro scale question when it comes to assembling a late period kit, is it best to make sure that you get your arming garments and your arm armor from the same vendor? No, I don't see any reason for that. I haven't done that myself. My arming garments come from all sorts of different sources. My Gammazons are entirely commercial. Fortunately, the commercial Gammazons that I am wearing, this one came from Revival, happen to fit me perfectly, like they were tailored for me. I am not a large person. I'm only 5'7" and about 155 pounds, and I wear a small. There are not a lot of people who wear small, so these fit me really, really well. But if you're having one made for you by some of the very reputable vendors, you don't have to have your arming garments made. But before you order armor or make armor for yourself or have an armorer make you armor, you must have all your arming garments together so that you can take the correct measurements and ensure that your armor fits them. That's super important. One of the other things, when you make your arming garments, they don't come with eyelets in them, of course. Only after the armor is complete do you then put the arm armor on, slide it up to where it has to be, and then you mark exactly where the eyelet are in the armor leathers, and that's where you put them in the arming garment. You don't try to match something to something that already exists. It's very difficult to do, and it never fits correctly. I hope that answers Antonio's question. Rasa asks, do you have any strong opinions regarding the Charles Blois point, Grand Assiette sleeves, versus the Charles VI Jupon with the more standard set-in sleeves? Yeah, This is a Grand Assiette Gammazon that I'm wearing right now, and it does its job admirably. I couldn't have made this Gammazon for the $120 it costs. It's all cotton, and this one I've had for 7 years. It's very serviceable. Like anything, it needs to be patched, and there are missing buttons. But as far as the designs go, I have also worn Gammazons with set-in sleeves. As long as the inset leaves enough to be able to raise the arm without pulling the entire garment up appreciably, you should be okay, because the fact is your leg harness attaches to the Lindeneer, not to the Gammazon. Only your upper body armor attaches to the Gammazon. And therefore, the difference between the Pourpoint, the Charles Bois, and the Charles VI Jupon, or at least the assumption that that's a Jupon, is that we know without a doubt, Charles Bois Pourpoint was not an arming garment. It was a civilian garment. Sarah asks, how do you recommend going about adapting padding to fit SCA requirements for joint padding? Well, the requirements for joint padding, and I'll admit I don't have either the Middle Kingdom Handbook or the SCA Handbook in front of me, but the requirements for hard over soft padding vary a bit and are defined in some pretty specific ways. I can only say that the gamboised chausses that I wear under my harness not only have taken the stoutest of blows in the most desperate battles at the Pens of War, but have also been passed by pretty much every marshal who's ever looked at them. So it's a matter of making sure that what you're wearing is both practical and legal, but it doesn't have to be outrageous. And padding over the joints, I don't wear other padding than my Gammazon under my steel arm harness. This is all that's under here. And the chausses are all that's under here. Additionally, do I have any thoughts regarding modifications to the kit to adhere to rapier cut and thrust? I don't have any reason to believe that it wouldn't already fit those strictures. I'm not sure if there's a specific question that's being addressed there, Rasa, but if there is, you can certainly write me or ask again. I'm happy to chat about it so that I understand what your question is and don't lead you astray. JC asks, were Lindeneer used into the late 15th century? Not by the upper noble class. By the middle of the 15th century, the arming coat was getting shorter, though it was still very, very tight around the hips. And the leg harness was attached to the arming coat, as was the arm harness. In the later 15th century, the arming coat became very tightly laced in this area, very often still buttoned here, and usually ended around here. And the leg harness was then pointed directly to the arming coat itself, because the coat was then immobilized around the hips and could not raise. Also, very frequently, non-inset sleeves were used. Some of the Burgundian styles were a little outrageous, in the later 15th century, but in particular, English armor of the 15th century, which went in very unique developmental directions, were very, very indicative of the kind of plate. And by the way, English knights of the period easily from the 14th century all the way on They fought on foot in general, in ranks with their soldiers. They did their cavalry thing, whatever that might have been, but even the highest ranking of the commanders, like a Cressy, Agincourt, Poitiers, all of those, Norfolk and Suffolk, even the Black Prince himself, he was on foot. So their armor had to be able to handle that kind of combat. So the Lindeneers didn't persist for the highest class armor into the late 15th century, but of course you might have seen that in handed down armor, which would have been gorgeous armor. Freddie from Eldermere. They ask, how marked is regional variations between countries and regions? Temperature, dampness, impact materials, how certain garments are worn. Well, throughout Europe, there are quite a few variations in style and preference. As I just mentioned, English armor is very different from the continental armors. German armors and garments, German or Italian armors and garments, the French, which is an amalgam of those two, in fact, and all of them are very different than what the Spaniards wore. It wasn't necessarily about climate, but it was about style, because armor and arming garments followed civilian garments. They all had their own styles and traditions. So when you look at the English armor of the period, and we have precious little 14th century armor that survives in any country. There's the stuff at Castle Cherbourg, and those are all Germanic, Austrian, that kind of thing. Some Italian, some of that stuff is. But if you go to Musée de l'Armée in Paris, there's only one little case that has actual provenanced 14th century armor in it. So it did vary, but it wasn't necessarily about climate or anything like that. Let's see, have I addressed everything?
It seems so.
Okay.
Anybody else have any more questions?
Well, if anybody does or would like some information, please don't hesitate to ping me anytime, and I'm happy to offer whatever I might. And I hope this was both informative and interesting, as well as useful. And for those of you who will be looking forward, like I am, to when we can all be together again, I'd like to say that one of my goals, because I really love this particular period, because it fulfills my vision of what a medieval knight was. Everything that we ever saw in movies and Camelot and God knows what, everything that is still near and dear to my heart. There's a certain milieu to it all. We have the opportunity in the SCA to be as we've never been before, and to be as no one else has ever been. We share a great deal with each other, and though we miss each other tremendously, when we are together again, I hope that the time has been spent in defining what we want to explore with each other. For me, it means spending a great deal of time exploring not just the why and wherefore of authenticity, but why it is so cool and looks really interesting, but also why it works so well and makes our fighting super different for those of us who fight. By the way, all of the things I discussed about authenticity and why one would do it apply equally to earlier periods, the 13th century in particular. It's not just mail thrown on over a padded Gammazon. So there are so many things that we have yet before us, and I will look forward to seeing all of you both on the field and off, and seek me out when we are able to, and I will be happy to bore you at length with whatever I know. Thanks very much for being here. I really appreciate it. And once again, thank you to the Royal University of the Mid-Realm for arranging all of this.